This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Kal's Corner here on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. My name is Kal Korff, and I'm your host. This is a weekly show produced by the legendary Rob McConnell. Again, my name is Kal Korff, and I'll be your host for the duration of the show, of course. So, last time we were on the air, we promised to talk about the goings-on in Zimbabwe. The longtime dictator, Robert Mugabe, has effectively been ousted in a coup that happened there. Let's talk about that a little bit. I'm sorry we didn't get to it last time. It's because I droned on too long about JFK's assassination, giving you guys a little bit of history of my involvement in that subject, as well as announcing the release of more documents by the U.S. government under orders of President Donald Trump. God bless him for that decision. It was long overdue. Obama should have given that same order when he was president, could have done it on the anniversary of the assassination, but he refused to do it, and there was no valid reason for it. And we can safely say that because now, having looked at the documents that Obama insisted remain classified at the recommendation of his minions in the intelligence community, you can see that there was nothing there that should have remained covered up a long time ago, even before President Obama served 8 years in office. And that's ironic coming from Obama because for years he falsely told the world that his administration was the most transparent in the history of American politics or the history of the United States. Talk about a humble individual, especially since it was a blatant lie. Let's be honest about it. We have to remember that under Obama, there were more violations of the Freedom of Information Act laws than any other president before him. And also, record numbers of journalists were prosecuted by Obama because, again, he's the most transparent administration in history. Not true, but, that's what he kept telling people. So, getting back to the issue of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe was, of course, a despot dictator. Many dictators become despots or enter office as despots. Unfortunately, Mugabe has a history of being lauded by left-wing liberals who, of course, don't live in Zimbabwe, and they seem to think that seizing of lands and taking them away from white people was the right thing to do, even though some of the white people who own those lands got them legally, so-called fair and square, and so on. And let's be honest, Africa as a continent, it's not a nation, it's a continent, of course, is largely a failed one. That has been true for a long time. The myth that the left-wing liberals love to tell you is that white men have oppressed Africa and that they, of course, started slavery. And that's not true. They're ignorant of history when they make that claim. White people did not invent slavery. In fact, in the history of human evolution, white people, which are really genetic mutants, that is, the skin of human beings became whiter as they migrated more in the northern areas of the world, such as in the Scandinavian countries. Neanderthals, for example, had lighter skin than their ancestors did who lived in Africa. So white people are late in the evolutionary game. If Adam and Eve, for example, existed, they were not white. Neither was Jesus Christ. The odds of him being blonde-haired, blue-eyed, like the stereotypical iconic Hollywood image, which of course is racist-driven and historically has been racist-driven over the centuries by white Europeans. Jesus was not white. He would have had darker skin, most likely brown eyes, thick, big lips, and so on, very curly hair, long hair, etc., and a beard, of course, because that's how people wore or dressed at the time or had their appearance at the time thousands of years ago. So the idea that Africa is failed only because of the abuses that have occurred because of white people, it's not that simple. In fact, a lot of Africans sold their fellow Africans to the highest bidder, had their own slaves. Everybody from Egypt to all of the past empires had slaves. That includes the Romans, the Greeks, of course, and the Egyptians. Egyptians, of course, are Africans. And slavery itself goes back a long ways, back through human history. So it wasn't something that was invented just by white people. And if you fast forward to the present, you see that Mugabe was overthrown because he was trying to install his wife as a replacement. I think he's about 93 years old. And of course, he's not all there anymore, mentally, physically as well. And he was trying to install his wife, who was about half his age, into power to replace him. And of course, this did not set well with much of the country. It is Mugabe and nobody else who has essentially bankrupted and looted Zimbabwe. And these left-wing liberal apologists for him who think that Mugabe is some sort of hero, these are the same bozos that often have praised communist dictator Fidel Castro and some other left-wingers. And they totally excuse the mass slaughter of human beings, mass murder of human beings that Castro committed. They totally ignore the fact there's no free speech in Cuba, that there's no right to have multiple political parties, that there is no right to have freedom of assembly. They say, oh, but, Cuba has free medicine. Well, big deal. They also have free education. Big deal. That doesn't make the system right, okay? A communist dictatorship is going to give free medicine. It's going to give free education, because what passes for education in those countries is not really objective, critical thinking type Western-style education. It is instead indoctrination. That is a more accurate term for it. So Mugabe had ousted his longtime attack dog, who left the country and not coincidentally went to communist China. China, of course, is one of the largest investors overall in the continent of Africa, because the communist Chinese and the Chinese as a culture historically have been long-term thinkers. They don't run their country one quarter at a time like the United States and the West tend to do. They tend to think years ahead of time, decades ahead of time. And of course, China eventually plays for keeps and to win. And what China is trying to do, and has had an open, active program to pursue, is of course to become the dominant world superpower, surpassing the United States by the year 2050 at the latest. This is why they constantly go after India, because it is a regional and, in the minds of the Communist Party in China, an existential threat. They, of course, want to topple the United States, both militarily and absolutely economically. And the irony of China's rise to its current pariah predatory status, where it is a global threat to world peace and stability, especially in the region of Asia, is that their growth, their success is being paid for by the West. Think about this for a moment. Where would China be today, and where would it have been all of these years that it has become an economic superpower? Where would it have been if nobody had paid it to build goods cheaply? Now, let's look at Apple, for example. And people who know me know I love Apple. I believe in their products. I worked there at Apple and their software subsidiary, Claris, for a total of 7.5 years on 2 different occasions. It was one of the best jobs I ever had. And of course, having met Steve Jobs many years ago changed my life. It caused me to switch my career to go into IT. I've pretty much split it in my life between IT and journalism. Apple, there are about 5 million Chinese who have jobs building Apple products. Think about that. It's mostly the iPhone, of course, but 5 million people. And Apple's not alone. Most companies, including, ironically, President Donald Trump, who is supposedly anti-Chinese and wants to bring jobs to America, well, he has his ties made in China. He's a hypocrite, let's be honest. So imagine the business model, if you will, of the Communist Chinese. They take the money from the West. They then use that to build up their military and economic clout and infrastructure. And then they use it ultimately to destabilize and overthrow the West to become the world's dominant power. You got to love it. Having your enemy bankroll its own implosion, that is the exact business and government model that the Communist Chinese are using. And they are succeeding because the West is stupid enough to go ahead and let that happen and bankroll it and give that money to Communist China instead of giving it to a country like India, which is the world's largest democracy. And although it is a very corrupt country, I'll be very blunt about it, India, ironically, is the world's largest corrupt democracy, at least it's not communist. And India, considering all of its neighbors, is arguably the only sane country in the region that it occupies. So, back to Zimbabwe. Mugabe is out. He finally resigned. And I hope, going forward, that Zimbabwe can recover from the enormous damage that Mugabe himself inflicted on the country. He did everything from bankrupt the treasury to, of course, destroy its once formidable and incredible record of being an agricultural powerhouse. He totally destroyed that. Time will tell whether his successors will succeed, or whether genuine democracy itself will return to Zimbabwe in a form that Zimbabweans never experienced during the decades that Mugabe lorded over them, masquerading as a champion of the people, when in reality he was yet another dictator despot who deserves, I think, not only not to be in power and to have been removed, and thankfully he has been, but I think he should be put on trial for crimes against humanity, crimes against his people, and again for taking land that was appropriated illegally, removed from white people. Some of that land was seized properly, let's be clear, but some of it was also given to Zimbabweans. That's the short version of what is going on in Zimbabwe. The world waits to see what's going to happen and whether things will emerge peacefully there and finally get started in a direction that it should have been a long time ago had Robert Mugabe not been the despot that he was. So that's a short summary again of Zimbabwe. Now let's turn to another part of the world, the small country of Yemen. It turns out that another dictator, Ali Abdullah Saleh, is dead. He is dead because he decided he was no longer going to align himself with the Iranian-backed Houthis, which are Shia Muslims. Instead, he was reaching out to their regional and ideological and religious rivals, the Saudis. And the moment he told the Houthis, we're going to end this war and try to find common ground with the Saudis, he now, of course, is dead and is paid with his life for that decision. So with Saleh out of the way, this effectively guarantees that the Houthis now will effectively take over what remains of Yemen. And, of course, this is a step closer to a showdown between the Saudis and the country of Iran for dominance in that area of the Middle East and Africa. And after the break here, we'll explain how and why that is taking place, as well as the impending decision, it seems, that American President Donald Trump is finally going to declare that the city of Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, not Palestine, and he is, of course, talking about possibly moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in recognition of that long historic fact. We'll be back after this commercial break.
Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X-Zone Broadcast Network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365.
This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
Welcome back to the second segment here on Cal's Corner, a radio show here on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. My name is Kal Korff, and I'm your host. The show's executive producer is, of course, the one and only legendary Rob McConnell. Now, as we were discussing before the break, there is a development that has occurred where in the Middle East, in Yemen, now that Ali Abdullah Saleh is dead, he died shortly after declaring that he was going to stop the fighting with the Saudis and try to find common ground with them. Now he's dead. The Houthis, of course, was a group that he supported. What happened was that Iran, which is Saudi Arabia's regional, ideological, and religious rival, they, of course, support and have been funding the war, backing the Houthis' attempt to overthrow and control Yemen. There's been a civil war going on for actually a couple of years now. And the deposed former leader of Yemen is, of course, now in Saudi Arabia. He defected to that country where they have been sheltering him there. And what had happened is the Saudis and the Iranians have been using their proxy forces in Yemen to essentially conduct war against one another. Now, this is happening because in Islam itself, and of course Iran and the Saudis are driven by this religion, at least their interpretations of it, there's been a war within Islam that's been going on for over 1,400 years. This is a war between the Shia Muslims and the Sunni Muslims. Shia Muslims are the minority group of those in Islam. The Sunnis are by far the most dominant. Iran is the world capital of the Shia religious movement, and of course the Saudis claim that they are the capital of the Sunni religious movement, even though most Islamic nations that practice Sunni Islam do not follow the very strict conservative implementation of it that the Saudis do. For example, in neighboring United Arab Emirates, which it's a country I've been to. We've actually broadcast here on this show from that country. I always have a great time in its capital city, Dubai, and of course, rather Abu Dhabi as well as Dubai. And in that country, women do not have to cover themselves. They are allowed to roam around free as they want without a male relative having to escort them. They don't have to cover themselves. They can drive. You can eat pork if you want, although it's not very popular there traditionally. There's a lot of freedoms in the United Arab Emirates. I even saw bikinis there. In the entire 7 years that I've lived in India so far, I never saw a single bikini, even though the heat is incredible in India and the very hot summers. And of course, there are hot summers in the United Arab Emirates. So when you compare and contrast the type of Sunni Islam that goes on in the United Arab Emirates, it's much more tolerant and flexible, if you will, versus its Saudi counterpart. You can have alcohol and go to bars and discos to the wee hours of the morning in the United Arab Emirates. Good luck trying to do the same in Saudi Wahhabia. And Saudi Arabia is nicknamed Saudi Wahhabia because the main religion of Saudi Arabia is known as Wahhabism. And Wahhabism is a radical, extremist, intolerant form of Islam that thankfully only 5% of Muslims adhere to. It's considered the redneck version, for lack of a better term, of Islam. And it is hate-driven, and it's based on intolerance, because the doctrine of Wahhabism says that you can never form a genuine friendship with anybody except a fellow Wahhabi. It also says that your job as a Wahhab is to convert everybody to your version of Islam, to give people an ultimatum that if they don't convert, they will be killed. And that is exactly what has happened over the centuries that Wahhabism has been around. In fact, in the violent, brutal history of Saudi Arabia and the way it came into being, Ibn Saud, who formed modern Saudi Arabia a long time ago, he aligned with Wahhabi radicals and cut a Faustian bargain with them. He said, basically, you agree to make me the chief Wahhab, the main guy in charge, the king, and I will support you. I will bankroll you. You can spread your radical Islam all over the world. Just don't criticize me. There is no criticism of the royal family allowed. Let's help each other out. I need your violence and your ability and desires to kill everyone who refuses to convert. I need soldiers like that, and we'll cut this deal. And that is exactly how, in a short version, Saudi Arabia came into being. Now, what is happening in Saudi Arabia is rather interesting now, because the current prince of Saudi Arabia, he is about to take over the throne from his father, and he has announced that they are renouncing all violent extremist forms of Islam. He says that Saudi Arabia is going to return to the tolerant form of Islam it once enjoyed. While historically that's never been true, he just made it up. Let's be honest, history does not support what he just said. It is welcome news that he is going to liberalize his country. Women, for example, are not only got the right to vote recently, but they're now going to be allowed to drive. Now, of course, in typical Saudi implementation of this, it's with permission of their husband or relatives, I guess. That's not true freedom, but at least it's a step forward in that direction. What is important is that the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia has issued a religious decree declaring, as we covered in a previous show, that Jews are no longer the enemy of the Saudis and Islam. It is wrong to hunt them down and try to kill them and try to go to war against Israel. That's a huge change. And he has said that we will welcome and be tolerant of all other religions. Now, does this mean that synagogues and Catholic churches and Christian churches and Buddhist temples are going to suddenly appear being erected in Saudi Arabia? Doesn't mean that yet. In fact, if that day should ever pass, and hopefully it will, it'll be the ultimate proof that the Saudis really are opening up and are genuinely reforming themselves from within. Now, the current prince of Saudi Arabia has made sure to sideline all of his political opponents or any potential rivals that might question his claim to power, since he's going to succeed his 83-year-old father, the king, in the very near future. What he has done is he has had hundreds of princes arrested. They remain holed up in a hotel. And what he has done is he has announced that he is creating an economic zone, a kind of Saudi version of the United Arab Emirates, if you will, that is going to literally be about the size of the country of Egypt. And in this zoned off area, women will be allowed to walk around freely. They don't have to cover themselves. They can even wear bikinis. Alcohol will be sold. Capitalism will be there because it'll be a duty-free zone. Western technologies are going to move some of their companies in there, because what's happening in Saudi Arabia is there is a explosion in the population of young people, that is, people considered to be under age 30. They need jobs. They don't have jobs. And Saudi Arabia right now is a one-dimensional economy. It's oil or nothing. And what has happened to that country is that because the price of oil has tanked over the years, thanks to breakthrough technologies like fracking, largely invented and championed by the United States, the price of oil globally has plummeted, and the Saudi economy has suffered accordingly. It used to be in the good old days that the Arab world and the oil powers used to bank on, this includes Russia as well, basically a market price of $100 per barrel of oil. Now they're lucky if they get 25 or 30 bucks a barrel. So what has happened is countries like Russia, Venezuela, Nigeria, they have all suffered economically because they've been overly dependent on oil. They failed to diversify their economy, which is their own fault, let's be honest. They could have taken all those billions of dollars over the years that they made when they were really being greedy about it, and the price of oil was well over 100 bucks a barrel. They could have used that to diversify their economy and their country, but they didn't do that. Instead, it went to the despotic leaders of these nations. And you can see that countries like Venezuela today, they're in serious trouble. Now, Venezuela is also in trouble because it's a socialist country, and socialism has always failed historically. Look at the history of socialist countries. You can see that socialism doesn't work. And probably one of the best examples of that from history is, ironically, the former Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, formerly known as the USSR, or the old Russian communist system. It, of course, imploded on its own. Nobody helped it implode. It was doing its job as socialism does. It ultimately fails. So what has happened in Saudi Arabia is there is this revolution from within that is coming, led by their young prince, who is going to be the king of that nation pretty soon. And he is planning to spend anywhere from $600 to $700 billion to develop again an area that is enormous, roughly the size of the country of Egypt, in what is going to be the Saudi implementation of the United Arab Emirates and what they have achieved, being one of the top tourist destinations and, of course, a economic powerhouse for the financial markets in the Middle East. Now, as the Saudis supposedly become more Western-like, more tolerant, open up their society, quit practicing this draconian form of Islam, recently they held a summit that involved a couple of dozen Arab nations where they have all aligned against fighting terrorism. That is a huge development, because if the nations who are part of this movement, this alliance with the Saudis, keep to their word and actually are consistent in how they prosecute Islamic militants, this means that groups like Hamas and Hezbollah are going to be increasingly under pressure to either go out of business or reform their ways or stop being terrorists. And that's interesting because in the case of Hamas, the Saudis used to support them openly. Now, of course, they have declared Hamas to be a terrorist group, which it always has been. It's not a group that is really into what it calls resistance. That is a euphemism for being a terrorist. And of course, you have Hezbollah, which is backed by Iran. And again, it is a proxy of Iran. They are, again, Shia Muslims. And you have, again, through Hamas and through Hezbollah and through these different terrorist groups like the Islamic State, who are, of course, sympathetic with the old guard of the Saudis, the conservatives, the Wahhabis, they now are going to have to make a decision that without support from Riyadh, from the Saudis, this essentially isolates them and leaves them on their own. And it again pits a showdown between Saudi Arabia and, of course, the country of Iran in their war of continuing this war in Islam between Shia and Sunni Islam. We'll be back after the commercial break here, and we'll continue. I'm Kal Korff. I'm your host.
This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X-Zone Broadcast Network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365.
Welcome back to segment 3 here on Kal's Corner, the radio show here on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. Again, my name is Kal Korff, and Rob McConnell is the executive producer. So as we were saying, there are some major going-ons in the Middle East. A showdown between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And while many people listening to this or catching the stories here and there in the news say, this doesn't affect me, it's going to affect you. Just like if war breaks out in North Korea to try to topple that regime and stop that mad dictator from continuing to try to destabilize the world, it's going to affect you, whether you like it or not. So what's going on, again, is a major showdown that is building up literally every day between the Saudis and the government of Iran. And Iran, of course, is the world's greatest sponsor of terrorism. On the other hand, the Saudis have sponsored terrorists in the past. It is not a coincidence that Osama bin Laden was a Wahhabi, of course. And the reason that he declared war on the Saudi government is he felt they weren't radical enough. It bothered him that the Saudis made the smart decision to allow U.S. troops to come in during the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, to try to oust Saddam Hussein's military from the country of Kuwait after it had invaded it. It was a successful effort. The war lasted about 72 hours once it started. And of course, Saddam Hussein went back into his own borders. And then over the next years, eventually he was deposed by President Bush's son, George W. Bush, and the rest is history. So that is going on in the Middle East. Now, in the middle of all this, or at least a key player, is of course the United States of America. Russia also has a formidable presence now in the Middle East, thanks to the foreign policy debacles of former President Barack Obama. Now, the reason I'm blaming Obama for it is the only reason that matters. He's guilty. Let me prove it, and I've written and reported on this many times before. You have to remember that when Barack Obama ran for president, one of the things that he attacked President Bush over was that you don't play regime change games, okay? But what does Obama do the moment he gets into power? He cuts a deal with the Saudis and the country of Turkey and the country of Egypt and Kuwait and a few other nations to form a coalition to try to oust Syria's brutal dictator, Bashar Assad. Now, the reason Obama did that, and he worked with his then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to come up with this grand plan, is because Syria is backed by Iran and backed by Russia. If the Syrian regime could be overthrown, a la Arab Spring style, what would happen is that this would weaken Iran, and of course weaken Russia. Russia had a token base in Tartus, a naval base up there. Now they have a couple of airfields because they have extended or expanded their footprint in the region of Syria. So what has happened is, by trying to topple Bashar Assad, Obama was negotiating with Iran secretly to try to come to this nuclear deal that was eventually reached. And if they could get rid of Assad during those negotiations, by the time a final deal would be reached with Iran, the terms would be much more in favor of what the U.S. wanted versus what Iran ended up getting away with. And that's critical, because if you look at the Iranian deal, it ended up not being a very strong deal at all, and it is understandably condemned by countries like Israel and the Saudis. Their point being, which Obama and former Secretary of State John Kerry completely ignore, is that the best and safest agreement is to come up with something that guarantees that Iran cannot destroy or ever build a nuclear weapon. You must completely destroy their facilities that allow them to do that. But yet, under the nuclear agreement that was eventually reached and signed, this never happened. Instead, the issue of building a nuclear weapon was kicked 10 years down the road for future presidents to deal with. Iran, for example, under the agreement, is obligated to reduce the number of centrifuges that it uses to enrich uranium. And you say, wow, that's great. That means they won't be able to build a bomb. No, that's not true. It's never been true. That idea is a lie. I am one of the journalists who exposed it as a lie years ago in my published articles. It turns out that Iran will be allowed to replace the centrifuges it must reduce in total number with more efficient, modern, later generation centrifuges that produce more uranium faster, so they don't need as many of them. So they're actually upgrading. Now, what kind of security agreement use your brain here, folks. What kind of security agreement is real security when your enemy is allowed to improve and become more efficient? In other words, you can say, well, they're reducing the number of tanks they have. Yeah, they're replacing them with something else that's even better. Is that security? No, it's not. Obama had falsely said, as did John Kerry, they both lied, let's be blunt about it, that these were the toughest sanctions or inspections ever imposed by the UN Security Council, and of course the entity that regulates the flow of nuclear materials around the world. They were saying that, there's never been a tougher set of inspections. That's not true. In fact, it is a blatant lie. The sanctions that were imposed against Libya, who eventually coughed up and destroyed all of their chemical and nuclear weapons facilities, as well as Saddam Hussein, as history has proven, were much more tough than those that Iran is forced to endure. Because let's say that UN inspectors want to go ahead and inspect a facility in Iran. They suspect something's going on that shouldn't be. Iran can say no. That's it. And if the UN insists on inspecting that facility, then they have to have a confab and a meeting, and the majority of those members would have to agree that yes, Iran should be inspected, and Iran can still say no. And then Iran has to be given as much as 6 weeks notice for those inspections. Now, what kind of verification, real-time verification is that? It's a joke. One last point. Obama had said that Iran, they would be under camera monitoring 24/7. What Obama didn't tell you is that monitoring, that recording, was not live. In fact, there's a delay of about 24 hours. So what Iran could do is turn off the camera, do something illegal, then turn it back on, and then give that footage to the inspectors. And if you do it right, as anybody who's played around with a home video in a simple editing system can easily prove, you'd never know they were doing things illegally. In fact, some of the sites where we know that there were nuclear warhead miniaturization tests conducted are off limits to inspectors. So again, there was no security there. What Iran decided to do was agree to this deal because they wanted hundreds of billions of dollars that they would get as a reward for not building a nuclear weapon. Now, that's a wonderful gig if you can get it. Imagine being paid by the international community hundreds of billions of dollars not to make a nuclear weapon. Now, if I could get that job, I'd sign up in a heartbeat. I would love to be paid not to break the law. I mean, we should all be so lucky. So it's not a genuine security deal. And in 9 years from now, Iran will still be on the precipice, on the border of making nuclear weapons anytime it wants to. Who's to stop them? Now, this brings up the country of Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has consistently said, and he's right, that they will never allow Iran to build a nuclear weapon because Iran continues to threaten Israel to wipe it off the face of the earth. And Netanyahu released a video just the other day, and it was a very good one. He's a very good speaker, of course. He says that, yes, I do take regimes seriously who threaten to wipe out Jews, because history has taught the world that you have to take it seriously. And, of course, Hitler and the Holocaust come to mind as a prime example of modern history, even though it has gone on for a long time. So, of course, you have to take Iran seriously. When they say they're going to wipe out Israel, they have thousands of missiles. They would try to overwhelm the Jewish state and their missile defense systems. Israel doesn't have enough anti-missile systems to knock out all of the missiles that Iran could fire at it. One of the things that deters Iran from attacking Israel is the fact that Israel is an undeclared nuclear power. Israel, in fact, has more nuclear weapons than India does. So Israel has always had the ability to completely annihilate all the capital cities of the Muslim world. If the Muslim world were to unite against it and try to defeat it, they would understand that they would be out of business too. So it's probably not going to happen. Now, this portends to what's going on now. In the next couple of days, as early as 2 or 3 days from now, American President Donald Trump, according to leaked reports, is going to formally declare and say that he supports moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to the city of Jerusalem. He has been warned by the Palestinians that if he does this and declares that that he does this in support of the idea that Jerusalem is the eternal capital of the state of Israel, which it always has been, by the way, let's be honest, that the Palestinians will no longer participate in the peace process. Now, you have to laugh at that because they're not participating in the peace process now. In fact, what passes for leadership in the Palestinian government, this is their dictator, Mahmoud Abbas, who is in the, 11th year roughly of his original 4-year term in office. He, of course, is a dictator there. There's no real democracy there. He's one of the most corrupt leaders in the Middle East. He's got secret Swiss bank accounts totaling over $1 billion. It's no secret. In fact, he was Yasser Arafat's money bagman who helped Arafat siphon off money that was supposed to be given to the Palestinians under the form of international humanitarian aid. It went into Arafat and Abbas's secret bank accounts. He says, well, we're no longer going to help with the peace process. They're not helping with the peace process now. Abbas has always said that when Palestine finally exists, there will be no Jews allowed. Can you imagine if Israel said, we will not allow any Arabs or Palestinians in Israel? Israel would be rightfully condemned for having such a view because it would be wrong, but suddenly it's okay if the Palestinians do it? This is a double standard that doesn't make any sense. It is illogical, it is wrong, but you don't find the supporters of the Palestinians complaining about it because, let's be honest, many of those who support the Palestinians really hate Jews. Let's be blunt about it. So, what's going to happen, apparently, is Trump is going to walk a fine line here. He's going to sign the renewed delay order that the president has to every 6 months, saying that we'll keep it there for now, but we're going to move it eventually to Jerusalem. He's going to test the waters and see what happens. And the Arab world, of course, is going to be all upset over this. But at the end of the day, what can they do? Because the reality is, if they don't start supporting Israel, it's hello, Iran. You might as well start practicing your Farsi. We'll be back after this commercial break.
The Earth is under ever-increasing pressure from untenable lifestyles and growing populations. Yet, viable answers seem in short supply. What if I told you there's an ancient form that can empower you to take charge of your life? What if your entire family could be enfolded and supported by life itself, finding safe passage through challenging times? I'm Gwilda Wiyaka, founder and director of Path Home Shamanic Art School, with great news: an upcoming series of leading-edge online affordable classes based in an ancient form of shamanism, easily learned and used by your entire family. Galactic Shamanism, Art of the Ancients, Key to Tomorrow are a series of online adult and children's lessons instructing your entire family on natural law, how to cooperate with and be supported by the powers of the universe. Visit findyourpathhome.com to find these unique and powerful classes.
This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X-Zone Broadcast Network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan, and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365.
Welcome back to the fourth segment here on Cal's Corner Radio Show here on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. My name is Kal Korff, and I'm your host. Once again, the executive producer of the show is Rob McConnell. So what we've done over the course of this show, it's a follow-up to the last episode that we did, is I've given you updates on various things that have been going on. These are not one-time events. Yes, while the death of the former Houthi leader, Saleh, is a one-time event, meaning he's dead. You can't undo that. The ramifications of his death and what's going to happen going forward are, of course, very different. So, as we talked about in the previous episode, what has been going on in Saudi Arabia, the planned announcement and the changes. Now, of course, we do a follow-up to that. And you look at the issue of Palestine and the Palestinians and Israel and this announcement that Trump is going to make. All of this is interconnected. And speaking of Trump, it is actually quite amazing that he's moving forward with some of this because, of course, he's up to his ears in alligators and crocodiles, as he likes to put it. And while Trump has not kept his promise to drain the swamp, or maybe another view of looking at it is he has drained it and he's replaced the swamp inhabitants with more crocodiles or different kinds of them. You know, Trump is up to his ears in troubles because several people around him now stand indicted by the former director of the FBI and the special counsel now, Robert Mueller, or special prosecutor. So let's talk about that for a few minutes. I'm one of several journalists who have reported on this over the years, In fact, I have a book that I'm trying to finish, but I can't release it yet because it would be incomplete and premature. The title of that book is In Russia's Orbit: How the U.S. Government, Obama, and Others Spied on Trump and Associates. It is common sense, folks, as I've said before, that the U.S. government has spied on Trump for decades. It actually started doing that in a serious level under the Clinton administration, that is President Bill Clinton, and of course throughout all these decades. And the reason has to do with the fact that Trump is a very wealthy individual and he has a lot of interests financially worldwide. They involve, of course, Russians, Ukrainians, people from Kazakhstan. And if anybody, it doesn't matter who he is, starts hobnobbing with some of Vladimir Putin's puppets, of course they're going to come under the intelligence net, if you will, the radar of the intelligence community. And we know that everybody from German intelligence to Finnish intelligence to Lithuanian, Latvian intelligence to Polish intelligence to Ukrainian intelligence, they have all spied on Trump. They have documented what some of his associates have done. People like Paul Manafort. Manafort has been a long-time political operative for decades. He actually started when Reagan was president, and he has helped dictators and despots like the former president of Ukraine, who was a creature of Vladimir Putin. He actually helped get him elected and was compensated and paid millions of dollars. He even helped former Filipino dictator Ferdinand Marcos as a consultant. So Manafort has been doing this for many years. The fact that he now stands indicted for alleged money laundering should come as no surprise. And it was what we would call low-hanging fruit that former FBI Director Robert Mueller has chosen to go pick to nail Manafort, because he was FBI Director when some of this was going on. He knew where the so-called bodies were buried. And, of course, being a former DOJ official, both the former director of FBI, James Comey, and his predecessor, Mueller, they all know how dirty some of these people are because they have been involved in direct, straight-up deals with the Russian mafia. And as I prove in the book, which I will only release after the different investigations run their course, because I don't want to release anything that is premature or has to be updated a week later because of some new development. As I have always said, long before Mueller was appointed as special prosecutor, long before these indictments finally came down, that the key to understanding any possible issue of collusion, should it exist, rests ultimately with Ukraine. That is because Ukraine borders Russia, and because Putin has always used Ukraine and Kazakhstan as a triangle of money and money laundering pipeline vehicle, if you will, to the West. If you understand what's going on there, you will immediately understand what has happened all these years later. Now, since it is not anything new, it is actually quite old, and it's rather curious that Mueller would suddenly go after this when he had years to do it earlier when he was running the FBI, but refused to do so. The reason he refused to do so, as did James Comey, is because they were playing politics. And as I prove in the book, the United States government repeatedly in the past, maybe even still today, has cut deals with the Russian mafia in exchange for other issues, and other issues they feel is much more important than putting a criminal behind bars. Let me give you just one example. Loretta Lynch, who was the former Attorney General under Barack Obama, she had to scramble in the last part of her tenure in office to renew a agreement that the U.S. government had made with the Russian mafia not to prosecute certain criminals for money laundering. Now, you might say, well, why would the U.S. government let these guys off the hook? Well, the reason they did that is because the Russian mafia cut a deal with the U.S. government that in exchange for guaranteeing that certain Stinger-type missiles would not fall into the hands of the Taliban and other terrorist groups, the price was, you let us go, we'll make sure missiles are not being shot at planes and knocking them out of the air. Because Russia, as Ukraine has proven, the conflict there, Russia can turn on and off the spigot anytime it wants to, the same way that communist China turns on and off the spigot by officially condemning what North Korea does, but in reality, when no one's looking or covertly, backs what North Korea is doing. So that was the deal that was reached. And in exchange for that, some of the associates of Donald Trump, like Felix Sater, you can look him up, Felix, last name Seter, you'll see he didn't spend a single day in prison, even though he was guilty of money laundering and fraud, because Sater would go back to the Russians, cut the deal as the middleman, and it's amazing Sater is still alive and hasn't been eliminated as part of a long list of people that Vladimir Putin or his associates, we don't know exactly who has done it, has eliminated over the years. Sater still goes free. Loretta Lynch has outright lied when she says, well, I didn't know that his victims haven't been compensated in the phony land deals that he did because that's illegal. Yeah, it is illegal, but she doesn't care because the U.S. government would rather keep a Stinger missile out of the hands of Taliban terrorists, which I understand that to a point, rather than let the top mafia kingpins serve time in prison. Now, I understand that part of what is so-called justice, even the symbol of what is justice, is in the U.S. culture a blindfolded woman who has a scale and she's supposed to weigh the balance on both sides. I understand that deals are cut, prison sentences are reduced, people get credit for good time served, all that other stuff. But at some point, you got to say, look, Stinger missiles or not, if we don't start putting some of these people behind bars instead of letting them go scot-free, then the whole idea of a Department of Justice becomes a joke. And that is why in some of my reporting, I will put Department of Justice, the word justice in single quotes, because I'm trying to say this is no justice at all. Do you remember, for example, when there were 10 spies that were arrested, busted in the United States, then there were some hearings that were done behind closed doors, then they were deported to Russia. You'll remember that the Obama administration, the most transparent administration in the history of the United States, so it claimed, they never told you what those spies were doing. We now know, only because of lawsuits, and after Obama has skated clean away, that the reason that those people were let go is because there was a quid pro quo that was going on over this Uranium One deal that allowed the Russian government to obtain key sources of uranium from the United States, also via a trucking firm in Canada, who of course was being bribed, and the Obama administration knew it, by some of these Russians to go ahead and secure access to uranium. While there is no truth to the rumor, it's just wrong. The timeline doesn't fit, that Hillary Clinton was paid off to vote as she did in support of allowing the Russians to have this uranium. The rest, some of these other players in this issue are of course dirty and were convicted, did spend a little bit of time in prison, and of course there were bribes going on, and we now know that. So it is a complex world out there. There are quid pro quos all the time. Justice seems to be relative to the observer, and the U.S. government, right or wrong, and I argue a lot of it's wrong, has a long history of cutting secret deals with top mafia figures, and this goes back decades. If you look at the Kennedy brothers, who made part of their career on prosecuting the mafia, notice they did not go after the top 3 mafia figures. They went after lower-hanging fruit because they actually contacted some of those mafia figures and said, can you kill Castro for us? As we now know and have known for decades, but yet it's been reconfirmed in the release of these recent Kennedy assassination files. So we will be back next week for another episode of Cal's Corner here on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. My name is Kal Korff, and I'm your host. Thanks for joining us. Next week, we'll talk about a bunch of other different subjects, because on this show, we cover everything from politics to the paranormal, and that's a lot of topics. Thank you for joining me.